In this episode, we'll delve into the essential tactics for getting promoted faster. Our guest today will share her insights on how to define your career vision, build the right relationships, demonstrate your leadership potential, and navigate the organizational dynamics that can either propel you forward or hold you back. This is the way to 10x your odds of getting promoted. Our guest today is April Little, a seasoned career coach with over 15 years of experience in talent acquisition and human resources. April has helped more than 150 people progress faster in their careers, and she's here to share her insights and knowledge with us today. Welcome, April.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So let's get into it. Can you share a little bit about your journey and what made you transition to a career coach?
Sure. So I have been pretty vocal about this on LinkedIn. I have spent the better part of 15 years of my career in talent acquisition and human resources. Did not like human resources, so quickly shifted from there. And I'll just tell you about my start. For anybody out there that's looking to even make a shift, I graduated, got a $50,000 degree in HR and could not land a job because I graduated in a time that is similar to now, 2010, 2012 region. So I couldn't find a job and I had to volunteer as a recruiter to get my start. And I didn't do that. I know a lot of people think like, oh, I can't afford to volunteer. I couldn't either. So I did it 1 hour a week on Fridays for a few months. And then I was able to land an agency job. So I spent the better part of 10 years just recruiting for various roles. I recruited professors, adjunct professors, sales professionals, and then I started doing executive recruiting as well. And from there, I started growing my career even more. And I was like, is there anything next for me? Do I want anything? And I think like many people, and I'm sure you both are aware of this, there's a lot of people who say, I don't want to grow my career. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But what starts to happen when you become a seasoned individual contributor is that you start getting more exposure than you want, depending on where you are, if you're really good at your job and you practice excellence. And so it's a really good exercise to start understanding, can I do more? And part of it was I exposed myself to a lot of people who were doing more. And I was like, I think I can do this. So you'll hear me talk a little bit in this podcast about finding a rabbit at work, somebody who's just a pace ahead of you, not 7 paces. So comparing to improve, not comparing to make yourself sick. And that's when I started accelerating my career. So I stayed pretty stagnant first 10 years, and then I got promoted 4 times in the last 5 years of my career before becoming a coach.
Amazing. I have to ask, you did mention human resources wasn't for you. Why was that?
I enjoy being the ambassador of the company, bringing people in, being excited. I don't enjoy the investigations and, a lot of that red tape. I didn't enjoy taking people's jobs away. I was so used to extending offers that I felt like a fish out of water saying, I'm sorry, we have to terminate you. It just didn't work for me.
That's all a hard part of that job. That's always that balance I see. And sometimes that's why people look at human resources like, that's the legal team instead of like that people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
April, you brought up 2009-10, which definitely was a tough period, and not the same, but along the same things are happening now. What kind of trends are you seeing in the marketplace for this year, and then what's your prediction of next year?
There's one trend that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of layoffs that we didn't have like in the 2010 region, because I feel like remote work wasn't a huge thing then. But one of the trends I'm seeing is layoffs through attrition. So there was a company just yesterday, I believe it was Walmart. You don't have to put that in the podcast, but I believe it was Walmart. They basically voluntold 700 people yesterday that were perm to work from home, that they have to either go in the office or leave. So one of the trends I'm seeing is voluntelling layoffs. That's the first one. I'm of course still seeing layoffs. I think on the upward side of that, I do look for some positive trends. And some of the positive trends I look for is, are cost center jobs being posted right now? That is a good indicator for the everyday person to look at the health of the company if they're hiring roles that don't bring in money, and a lot of them. And so I am starting to see more people accepting recruiter jobs, more people accepting what I call just, non-revenue generating. It's called indirect billing jobs. I am starting to see that a little bit more. That's not surprising. It is Q2, and we'll likely see that for Q3. We'll see it open up a little bit. I do think one of the other trends that I'm looking forward to is this is an election year. So that does mean that there's a lot of renewed energy around the jobs, and we're probably going to see more jobs right now. But in terms of trends, I've definitely seen people still wanting remote work, but it being taken away. Seeing a lot of hybrid roles. I'm seeing a lot of proximity roles. But I do also see on the up and up of that is that there are certain industries that are really stable. And that's insurance, finance, fintech's doing really well. Tech, of course, is always doing well. But I will talk a little bit about startups and how we're finally at a place, trend-wise, that I equally share with my clients that they should be looking at Fortune 50 through 1000s the same way they should be looking at startups, because it's all the same risk now. So that's the beauty of it all now. And I feel like startups, and if you want to accelerate your career, that is one of my secret formulas with my clients, is many of them work at blue chips. Artin, I want to make sure I'm saying your name right. You worked at Disney. So there are some really good companies out there hiring. And I think that many of them are open to, they want the blue chips, but it's being open to maybe the Series B, C, D company as well.
As far as trend goes, level-wise, I mean, are you seeing a lot of these openings more junior, entry level, or are you actually seeing some of the more leadership, executive positions being opened up, or is that just more internal circle that's happening?
I'm actually not seeing a lot of entry-level roles, which is why you're probably seeing all those call to actions on LinkedIn. They're requiring entry-level people to have 1 to 2 years of experience, which is oxymoronic. Where I'm seeing a lot of the roles is mid-level. I'll give you an example. I actually had a client a few weeks ago that was looking for a VP of marketing role. As we all know, marketing is being slaughtered right now. And looking for a VP of marketing role, it was taken down and the job was repackaged as a director role. And none of the requirements changed. That is one of the trends I'm seeing as well. So I am seeing a lot of companies getting a lot of just top talent. They're looking for a lot of core contributing responsibilities and more middle management roles. There are executive roles, but I have been working more so on the agency route. So I wouldn't say, I'm not somebody who believes in the what do they call it? The hidden job market as a recruiter, but I do understand confidential searches happen. And they more so happen by way of working with staffing agencies. So that's the best play. And I am seeing those roles open up too, but through an agency, not necessarily directly with the company.
Art and I did witness a fair amount of what you described with repackaging, even in our time at Disney. Whereas when I was at Netflix, there it was pretty normal that for a while there everybody was almost at this director, no matter what level what you came in at, but the pay was still relevant to your market value, which was good. So it's like the title just had less value there. It was their attempt to, I think, keep things more flat organization. But over time, I think they started realizing, okay, there's still a director reporting to a director, reports to a director, reports to a director. But I do think you see more and more of that packaging happen. And I think sometimes it's a technique, for the company to either pay the role less, or in some occasions, there is this attempt to not have as many at that level, just because they are trying to argue again, whether it's a flat company sense, whether they're trying to not take away the value of somebody else's title. Is there a particular thing that you would attribute seeing that, I guess, trend that you're currently capturing? Any reason for it that you could think of?
Actually, you brought up a really good point about it being paid within range of that. What I'm seeing is that a lot of companies are cutting back even on salaries. And so if you're able to sort of get what I call more of a job share kind of role or an expanded role, even though you're being paid, I would say, appropriately for a level, what that does is then you have a job. Your desk has been expanded essentially. So I do also see that as a very creative way of cutting costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we've seen. I'd be curious then, as we think about that, and as you can see that happening, and I think it's a reason why a lot of individuals actually in organizations end up in this point, especially if they don't speak up, stand up for themselves, are able to articulate, what they're actually accomplishing in that role, that a company may continue to do that for a while. And knowing that you work with your clients around promotions, around raises, around that area, what do you recommend for somebody who is hired in a role like that and find themselves doing in essence, 2 jobs, sometimes, or a job a level ahead?
I think the first thing is you will need to practice some degree of excellence to get whatever you want. So that'll be the theme here today, is that you will have to be doing a pretty good job. And I think that where you can start articulating that is maybe even going in, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, is as you ask for regular feedback from your leader in your one-to-one, and if you're doing well, I think that could lead to a natural segue in the conversation about what it's actually, what excellence is costing you. Having that conversation, so you're happy with the quality of my work. I'd like to also share that it's taken me 80 hours to do it. And while I'm happy to do that for right now until we can either get other headcount, it's unsustainable. So it's proving that it's starting off with excellence. Everybody ears opens up if you're doing a great job, that it'll stay open. So if you're first doing a great job, you can that creates a natural aperture to have that conversation with your leader about what excellence is costing you. From there, then you can have a conversation about what is it exactly that you need to continue to keep your performance up and for it to be sustainable. And you should be bringing benchmark data that maybe other companies of similar structures, there's 5 job bullets that are there, but they're there for you. and maybe your bullets might align to a higher level role. So leveraging, using some negotiation tactics, anchoring with some things that you already see along with your performance usually leads to a much better outcome. And usually you're not going to get exactly what you want after that first conversation, but it gets things going so your leader can go better equipped to their leaders to maybe create a new cost center for you, a new job title, promotion, or headcount.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because what ends up happening a lot is either an individual could get frustrated just because they're like, well, I'm not being paid what I should or whatever it is. And sometimes some will stop there versus, again, I think what you're saying is that conversation, having the conversation, because at least then you can open up, you can make sure that they're aware and you're not just bitter in silence that, you acknowledge this discrepancy, because a lot of organizations know it, but they're kind of like, well, if they're not saying anything, then maybe I won't say anything. And then you, I think, have that other dynamic at that point, which that boss themselves may struggle to have that conversation on their own. But when you are coming at it with certain data points and other things, now they feel a lot more confident. They're a lot more able to. And yes, it would be nice if that leader advocated for you out of the gate. But for a variety of reasons, I would say that doesn't happen as often as people would like. It's probably more the rarity that you have that type of leader, since most of them are more just the manager in the role, who sometimes even found themselves in the role without actually having experience leading people. So yeah, I do think that's so critical, because worst case scenario, somebody has that conversation and they get the reality of what that person is really thinking about their performance, which is, well, I know you think you're an all-star, but this is where you're not coming across, as that for us. And then you could decide from there if either, that's a middle finger to them, or if it's okay, I know now what I can do to turn this around. But if you don't have the conversation, then you're just, again, sitting in silence.
That's it. And you're expecting other people to understand the degree of your suffering while you're silent. And that's what also makes you even more bitter about it.
And would you say then that conversation that they have, is that the best way to assess, their skills and their gaps? Or do you think there's a better approach? Because when you talk about excellence, how does somebody know whether they're excellent or not?
You start to know that you're excellent if you start generating what I call rainmaking conversations. So that means that people start to know you as being excellent because you've been exposed to maybe some other functions in the business. You've done a great job. You'll start so if we think about how does that start to unfold a bit more in your day-to-day work, here's what it sounds like. It sounds like Michael coming over to my desk saying, hey, I'd like for you to just look at this. And you're in a whole entirely different function than me. But you value my perspective, or I value your perspective when I go to your desk and ask you. You start to understand excellence is not just tied to like your desk. Other people start to know that too. So that's a way for you to start seeing it. And it's basically Bluetoothing, I call it. You'll start seeing it a little bit more throughout the work environment. But I think that another way for you to know whether you're doing a good job is seeking, actually, and I'm posting about this at some point, seeking feedback from people that you actually respect. It's important you do that. And there are people that maybe you don't respect, but you know they do a great job, but we have to think about the information and whether you're going to internalize it and make change. So people that you might admire or respect, getting their feedback on a regular basis. And that person also should be your manager, because that's the way for you to avoid, to what your point earlier, Michael, is avoiding kind of surprises on your review if you're regularly having discussions and it's not just about work. Because if you don't actually make your own development a standard topic in your one-to-one, no one else is.
Now, what are your thoughts on, because you mentioned talking to people you respect. Well, a lot of people don't pay attention to the brand that they're often not even actually building themselves. It's sometimes being built on their behalf if they're not actively doing so, which still means they're doing it because the choices they're making are what's leading to that. But some of that could also be driven a lot by ultimately perceptions, and sometimes by the people they don't respect if they have the clout in an organization. So when it comes to that feedback, how much should they be taking that from individuals that they actually don't respect because they might have the political clout in an organization?
Fair. Love that point. I think that here's what I typically recommend whenever you're in that situation. It's really thinking about and separating and creating like a clear line of demarcation. So when there's somebody that maybe you don't like, I always say that if they can't attack your performance, they go after your character. They might go after certain things you can't change about yourself, nuances, that's their preferences, right? And that's not something that you necessarily want to change when we think about building an authentic work environment, because maybe, Michael, you might enjoy telling a story before you go into sharing data. Like one of my clients always says, no one was hurt making this presentation today. And then she'll go into it. And maybe you enjoy doing that, but the other person's, their preference is for you to just go straight into it. Okay, maybe you tailor to your audience, but you don't change that about yourself, even if that's the feedback, because that's more of a preference. But I think if it's something more tangible about the actual work you do, and they can give you an example, take it.
Great point. And I hope that person, by the way, who starts off their presentation that way, eventually starts a presentation that says 2 people were hurt in the making of this, because, at least it'll be that punchline.
Yeah. I like that too. You guys are definitely touching on like reality and perception. And most people, I think, outside of the high performers, have a false sense of perception of, they believe they're high performers, but they're not. When that person kind of comes to senses, what would you say is a good way for somebody to assess their skill sets to understand what their gaps are?
So I think the first thing is you have to have self-awareness. And Michael, to your point, you brought up something excellent. So you're building a brand, whether you want to or not. So it's up to you to control it. The first thing is when you decide that you want to start growing your career, a lot of people get there, right? Because whether we want to admit it or not, we see all these call to actions online about you should be able to grow your career as an IC. But look, most companies, their career frameworks are built around you being a leader. And that's where the extra titles and the money is going to come from. And I'm really sorry to say that, unless you're highly technical and you're in cybersecurity or something like that. But it's going to be tied to you leading people. And so when you get to that place where you're like, I'm kind of capped and I don't know what type of perceptions there are about me, you need to start first looking at how does everyone perceive me when I start talking? Okay, maybe I need to correct my communication. The second thing is do I overpromise and underdeliver? Meaning I'm like, oh, I'm on it, boss. And then I'm getting there's questions about my work or the quality of my work when I deliver it. Or do they say, okay, this is good to go? So are you starting to observe what excellence looks like? You don't need to create anything. The good thing about work is that there's skeletons everywhere. You can just build it from there. There's no need to build it. So I think part of it is starting to look at your quality of delivery, your quality of communication and connection. And then you could start doing that. Then you could start having some greater conversations with other people about what is it that I do well? What is it that I don't do well? And so when I do 360 feedback with my clients, I don't actually share who's giving the feedback. I'll give it to them as a culmination. And maybe that's also something you could consider doing, is making an anonymous survey for people who feel really comfortable to give you that feedback as well. And that's what I do for my clients. They don't know who gave it. I just give them culmination feedback.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. One of the things that was night and day between Disney and Netflix is that Netflix 360s happen regularly. In fact, feedback you're meant to give somebody ready. You get in trouble if you're like, you hear somebody saying, something about somebody else. Is like, did you tell them yet? No. Well, what are you waiting for? Like, it was so open,
Right.
which was great. And I loved it. That was their culture. Disney, on the other hand, it was, a little bit more what you described. We had a push to try to even get a 360. They were usually anonymous sort of things because that was what the culture was there, even if it was still a company that, we enjoyed working for. But it's just a difference in dynamics. And I think a couple of other things that you said there, I think is so critical. I think about the one on the, if something's delivered late or whatever it is, it's the friction. Like, how much friction do you add? Because somebody could deliver excellent work, but if to get them to it each time requires so much push, pull, chasing, whatever it is, then it kind of removes some of the value you see in the end from the excellence that they might deliver, and because of those other pieces that they face. And I think the other thing too about that self-awareness, because a lot of people struggle, and that's where I like with what you mentioned earlier on about that exercise, about where you do reach out to people. And what I like is I like people actually first doing a little exercise themselves where they say, here's how I think I'm perceived. Here's who I am. It becomes an image versus identity thing. And then when you have that conversation, you see how well that matches up. And that gives you a quick litmus test of your actual self-awareness. Because if what you said, none of the things you think are qualities about yourself, come up on the list that somebody else, does, or you didn't write any of the feedback you expected, you have a bit of a self-awareness problem. And I think, but that's the first step to get to the bottom of it, because now you got to own it, because it's like, or you do what some people do, which is they're all wrong, at which point I think we're back to the type of character that was described in the first place, where good luck advancing in your career.
Absolutely.
So I'm also curious in here, like for you, how big of a role does it play when it comes to the person really understanding what their their pay range, and how do you recommend, assuming that this is important, that they gather that sort of information?
Sure. Is the question prior to being in the organization or while you're working there?
While you're working there. Let's assume motion raise, they realize they want to advocate, but they're trying to go back to that piece about how do they arm themselves with the right information.
Yeah. And I will say that I do come from a slightly privileged background working directly in recruiting. So I'm aware of some of the things I'm going to say. People might say, well, I don't have access to that. I can tell you one way that you could learn salaries is we live in a world that I didn't live in even a few years ago, or that we all do now that we're all entrepreneurs. Pay transparency. You have it right there at your fingertips, and it's starting to understand what quadrants is the U.S. in. So we know that the large metropolitan metropolises are USA 1. That means they pay the most. And then you think about USA 2, which might be still expensive to live there. It's more like Southeast. And then you're getting to like USA 3, where that might be like that might be lower middle belt of the US, right? So thinking about when you're looking up those pay bands, and you start measuring yourself against all those pay bands and where your current job is for either the same company. And that's the big issue with companies right now. That's the reason why you see a range between 100 and 300,000.
Right. Ridiculous.
But the good thing is that it's a pay position, right? And so, yes, that 100 to 300,000 could take into account that might be across level 1 through level 7. But what we know is that about 50% of pay position is somewhere in the middle, right? And so then you could start really objectively looking at that in terms of what your organization's putting out there. Because if you work at a larger organization, chances are, even if they're not practicing pay transparency in all their sites, they're doing it in certain parts of the company where they are located, right? And so you can start there. Then you start with the competitors. They're direct competitors. They're looking to be a brand of choice. So I can tell you, when I worked at L3Harris, our direct competitor was Raytheon. So the salaries were on par. And so you could go pretty much straight across the board and take a look at that. I'll also tell you another sly way. When you start getting to the higher levels, it's starting to socialize, having those coffee chats, befriending recruiters that are in agencies. They are more available than a talent acquisition recruiter that works for the company. Starting to take some benchmark calls with them, but also considering making a small investment in a compensation tool like option 1. It might be worth it. So you can start looking at benchmarks with different sizes. Some of them are relatively inexpensive, and you could look at the ones that even maybe startups use, because startups, the reason why I advocate a lot for startups is that they like to create what I call velvet coffins for people. So we always went after the people that worked at Disney or the people that worked at Google. And we knew that we needed to pad those offers by an extra 20% to get them.
Interesting.
Yes. So they could stay, because we didn't want to constantly recruit all the time. So we paid about 20% higher than another corporate company because we wanted people to stay.
Yeah. Very interesting. With option 1, what does something like that cost?
So I could tell you back, I'm aging myself. I could tell you, I actually had one, and I may be even able to circle back and get it for the show notes. But there was one that I believe that might be $100 a month. Don't quote me. I will come back on that. But there's actually another tool that I used. I can't think of the name right now. But the tool was $25 a month.
Oh, wow.
They were a newer startup themselves for a comp tool. So just very inexpensive for you to really know. When you start playing above the 150K range, you don't want to play around with that. You want to invest and know what you could lose out on.
Yeah, I mean, that dollar range makes it accessible to many.
April, what's your perspective on, so like Michael and I, we spent a long part of our last 2 decades at Disney, and then Michael had, a few years at Netflix. And we observed a lot of people moving up the ladder pretty quickly because of the relationships they had, not necessarily what their output or performance was. How important is it to align yourself with a person that's going to pull you up, or that's just too difficult to figure out and just focus on good work?
It's almost more important than skill. And I unfortunately have noticed that just from working and promoting. I've personally overseen hundreds of promotions just being in TA, interviewing, helping the hiring managers make decisions, especially when it came to internals, as well as working in a higher level in my HRBP role. I have sat in on promotions that I didn't even necessarily agree with. But people didn't know when we sat in those 9-block meetings, people didn't know certain people that came up. They might have been introduced that first time where they're like, Michael or Artem was fantastic. And be like, but nobody knows them.
Yeah.
So, so at that point, it doesn't matter if you're in what I call that high quadrant of, the 9 block, because no one knows you. So it is really important for you to manage your career like a politician when you are ready to move up.
Which is hard for so many people, because of course they're like, I don't want to do politics. And it's like, but there is that reality to, no matter what, politics are dealing with people. You're going to deal with people no matter where you're at. But I know when I joined my first calibration meeting, as it was called, where it's exactly what you described, and you had all these folks sitting in there, including the HR. Like this is a red flag always for me, is if HR didn't know who you were and you were being put into a manager position, good luck. Because if that meant you're managing people and HR was never even exposed to you before, then that was automatically where you would get them expressing, wait, who's this person and how is this? So it was always one of those that was really important for me as a leader to make sure that there was that exposure and that you were purposefully making sure that these people knew who you were. Because it doesn't mean you always have to have the best relationship with every one of them, but they should know you enough so that when people are in there, in essence, with all their horses in the races saying who should get the promotion or who should get the raise, that you can actually, that others stick up for you, advocate for you on your behalf. Because if that doesn't happen, then your odds are low. And what it might mean is that was your first introduction to that group, and you won't get that again until next year, when now they at least know you because your name was put on their radar on the last one. But this is where I think it's always important that people time some of these things and these reach outs also in advance of when their actual ask is going to come if they want to increase their chances.
I agreed. If I can just add, you mentioned the influencers. Who was it? Who should I be socializing with at this point? And think about the person who introduces a thought in the room and it shifts the air. That's an influencer. Think about the person who says, here's why I don't think we should do that, and everyone listens. That's an influencer. Think about the person where everyone's like, are we all on board with this? But Arden, I actually want to get your thoughts before we close this out. That's another person you need to get to know. For me in particular, believe it or not, that person was our VP of sales, and I used to get to know him very well. So if he even had a perspective on something that wasn't even in his function, when we had round tables where all of the VPs were there and I was the recruiting rep that was in the room with them, he would sometimes, give people ideas. He was what I call a real rainmaker. He was able to speak in other functions. He was really good at that. That is somebody you want to get to know.
Nice. Yeah. I also like, whether people like this or not, again, because it's going to sound clicky possibly and take you back to, again, more politics, but it's like, there is there's the guilt by association or the success by association. And it's like when you're hanging out with more of the people who are seen as those who add the friction, who are not, leaning into excellence, versus those who maybe have been promoted more frequently of recent. Just being around those, not only can it lift you up in general, because you're hopefully also going to get some of the benefits of learning from them, but there's just that association that I think can make a big difference as well. But unfortunately, what I see a lot of time is then there's a clique that gets created of individuals in an organization who are unhappy or who are, have decided to take that stand. Like when they talk about quiet quitting is this really interesting balance, because on one hand, there's a piece, Art and I, who've had side hustles in the past, can understand where it's like, okay, you're doing what you still need, but you're still achieving, hopefully, excellence in your role. You just might not be going above and beyond, what you could do if you didn't have that side hustle. But then the other one is where you truly are like, no, I'm going to back off a bit on this because I'm not achieving what I want to achieve, which I think shoots yourself in the foot, because then you're not growing either in that role or to position yourself for whatever the heck is next on the outside. But do you have a position on quiet quitting?
I do. It's similar to the person that doesn't want to show you how to do their job. You're participating in your planned obsolescence, because then people don't know what you're doing. No one thinks that your job's important. And they're like, oh, yeah, she works over in the corner. She does that. And then they start figuring out that maybe it could be automated, or that maybe it could be an extra 10% added on to 3 other people, and bye-bye. That's what I think about it. I do understand why it happens, but I think there should be a plan with the quiet quitting. That's a short-term strategy. So maybe you're quiet quitting to protect yourself because you are dealing with a tyrant. And you're like, I am coming in and I'm giving you economy care as an employee. And I'm not doing anything extra because I need to free myself up to be on Indeed and Career Builder and LinkedIn after work. And I need to conserve my creative energy for that. So yeah, maybe that, right? But as a long-term strategy and expect to continue to stay there in these companies that are essentially like acting like Hunger Games right now, it's not going to work.
Yeah, it's strategic quiet quitting versus bitter or emotional quiet quitting, I guess would be that case. Yeah. No, and I fully support that first. In fact, something Martin and I often talk about is we contributed more in the workplace because of our side hustles, because we were accelerating our learning elsewhere that then helped us there, which can also sometimes be a nice hack, to growing faster in an organization if you are advancing your skill sets faster than others in the role because of whatever learnings, you attribute to that. I'm curious here, because some people oftentimes struggle with how they can show, like back to what you said, like these days, the reality is, and I say these days, I mean, it's been for a while, but the reality is an IC only goes so far in an organization where it's more rewarded often by, sadly, size of the team, or at least sometimes the size of the team. Sometimes you can't get to a certain role where it's not about the size of the team, any more. But with that, some of them struggled to be able to be like, well, how do I show that I have that leadership experience that is sometimes required to get there? So what would you recommend for somebody who's trying to illustrate that but doesn't have actual experience managing or leading a team?
I think you should think about the parts of your job that have like an enterprise air on it. So going back to your point, the highest I have seen that you can go, I know it could be different on other companies, is working a job that maybe you set the process and the standard, but maybe you're doing it at the enterprise level for the entire company. You can grow that, but every company doesn't have what I call like an enterprise type of sector of the company or corporate sector of the company where you set the tone for the rest of these segments in the organization. So I think the first thing that you want to think about doing is, what new processes do I bring? To what new thought leadership do I bring to the table that has impacted even our function financially, from a time perspective? Anywhere where you've cut costs, there's percentages that are in your favor. Think about that. I think the next thing is are you in charge of training anyone? That is leadership. Training people is leadership. I can tell you that that's actually how I got my start in leadership. Was I really loved recruitment practice, and I loved making sure that we followed OFCCP guidelines. And because of that, and because I always passed my audits, I then started training all the new recruiters. And then, so that's another thing that you can think about doing. I think when we think about even self-leadership is just as important. Does your boss need to know where you are? Do you have everything done? You're proactively sending them updates on things. You're thinking about things one step ahead. Do you own your function? Meaning, when you go to them, are you complaining, or are you a solution-oriented complainer? So you're complaining, but then you're following up, well, here's 3 things I recommend we should do. And I think that you think about self-leadership as another way for you to get that experience. And I think the last one is to think about any dotted line matrixed kind of direct reports you might have as well. There are people that you also have to work with, but you're in charge of maybe being the face of sharing that data, that information. You're leading them, but you are just leading them from a dotted line perspective.
All of those ring so true. And I think that self-leadership one that you said is so critical. And I think something a lot of people don't think about, because in the end, ultimately, when somebody's getting promoted into a role, the boss who's, making the decision, manager, is ultimately being like, okay, can this person help alleviate some of these things I'm having to do, the challenges, whatever problem they need solving that they're hiring a role for. If you know that there's that person who, again, just leveraging your words that you said before, is already leading with excellence. They may not be leading people, but they're leading their own work with excellence, which gives you confidence that they would bring that same discipline to a team that they had, which then means that, you're going to benefit. They're going to benefit from, or rather, the company's going to benefit, because now this organization is going to be trained on a similar approach and philosophy of what their work is. And then I think the other one too is, any projects. I think people overlook projects. If you have a project that's at least working, whether it's cross-functioning or at least even in your own group, and you're overseeing some things, that could be so huge. For Art and I, that was something for us as we stood up new processes all the time in our organization. And naturally, because we were the ones who were training people, much like you had said, it's like, well, people are seeing that. And I've seen another one too that some people do, where some individuals, despite being even more entry level, may have some leadership examples that they do because they join groups within the company that aren't even about their projects. They're about groups, whether it be diversity, inclusion, or something else, where they're having a chance to be able to show and illustrate this, because just that proactiveness, I think, is another huge thing for people to see that you sometimes don't see. And it feels like instead the person just wants the promotion for the money and the raise, which there might be people listening to this saying, well, yeah, what's wrong with that? But what the challenge with that is that sometimes, you're then missing those other key pieces that people are looking for.
I agree. And you touched on a really great point. And that actually didn't even come up, but leading like an IRG or ERG is huge, especially the ones that even have a budget. That's really helpful if you take on some type of treasury kind of responsibility in there, or you're in charge of reporting out on it. As we know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is like cutting back. So the companies are relying a lot more on the leadership in those IRGs. And so that is an opportunity for you to get in front of people and to share data and stats, and to also build some relationships, because we all know that a lot of executives get voluntold to be a part of IRGs.
Totally. Yeah. Art and in the past, we talked about this because it is one of those where you're like, oh, great. Or even those also leaderships who sometimes get appointed to a mentorship and they're like, I don't want to mentor people. It's always very interesting in those scenarios. But I think too, there's another example. Even then, if some people are like, okay, well, my organization doesn't have a lot of those. Well, something else that Art and I were known for within an organization is, some people might consider it more, I don't know, inspirational sort of leadership. But we would do things like organize TED Talks, but the TED Talks we would do would be an existing TED Talk, but we'd have a team member come, introduce it, have a chance to say what it means to them. And then you see these people shine there, because all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, you never got to see this before. And you see this whole other side. So I think it's even looking for situations like that and things you could do that might make the culture of an organization better, because that is rare. A lot of the times, so many organizations have managers in roles who don't actually care to lead. So if you can show up in that way, I think it's noticed and it's safe.
I love the idea of a internal TED Talk versus like Toastmasters, because Toastmasters feels so structured just around basic comms, and I think it has its place. But I like the idea of someone being able to bring in different stories that really can humanize just who they are, adds to their personal branding. It adds some extra layering and dimensions to who people think they are.
It was great. I mean, we had so many people really step out of their shell and comfort zone and then become comfortable in presenting, which can help them in other areas. So it was a great thing that was introduced. Let's say everybody's doing everything that we're talking about. Got feedback, is aligning themselves with the right people, but it's just not happening. They're really interested in that next level. How long should someone be patient until they said, okay, something is off here, I'm going to leave the company?
I think that the number is very personal to the person. but I would tell you 2 years, because I'm big into career fast tracking. And by the time a lot of people have invested and they're ready to invest 4 or 5 figures to work with a coach, they've tried some things. And that's what I have found. So I think in general, about 2 years or less is good, because you'll start to get bitter. You sit year and year and year. I even think 3 to 5 can get really tough, unless there are things that if you are being given tangible advice on how you could do something better, you respect that advice and it takes time for you to learn it. Though I still have some disagreement there, because I do believe that position mastery doesn't take 5 years. I do think that, companies just have a lot of saturation, so they do create that layering. And if you're not careful, you'll be the skeleton at the bus stop. So if you don't want to do that, I always say about 2 years or less. That's my personal marker. But I can tell you from my clients, by the time they've come to me, they've been sitting and they've been hearing different things. And if you don't mind, I'll give you a quick story time. I have a client. I recently shared the testimonial on my page. She wanted to get promoted. She's been in her role 10 years. She wanted to get promoted to a manager role. She can't leave. And I love working with people who want to play politics, and we play Game of Thrones together. And it's fantastic, because they don't want to just quit, because she has a pension. She has all the things. She can't just quit. I know that that's usually the advice, just leave. She didn't want to leave because she's like, I've worked here too long and my new boss is getting in my way. So we went to the boss a few times. Hey, I'm ready. How's my performance? It's great. Can you help me get exposure? Sure. I'm going to let them know. So we did that a few times to make sure that she was going through chain of command. What we found, very damning evidence, is we were like, okay, things aren't moving. Let's go build a new relationship. She checked in. We eardropped. That person said, oh, your manager never told me you wanted to grow. So she started building some really strong adjacent relationships throughout the organization. She also started doing kind of the IRG thing, and she started leading that. It took 11 months from start to finish, but she did just get an HR leadership promotion. A lot of people don't stick around for that. And I'm not saying that that works every time, but I will tell you is that trying all that you can so you don't leave an organization feeling like you have regrets is still the best path to.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think a lot of the time when at least what I find is when people are having these challenges and struggles, they initially want to try there because they like the company, they like some aspect around it. And it's like, okay, because otherwise it's just looking for a completely new role in general. But I think that framework that you broke down, I do think that's so critical because people need to give themselves, like there is an amount of time, especially if somebody's reaching out and getting support for the first time for somebody. And what they don't realize is they haven't even aligned. You got all the people in their corner. It's like from there, it's like, okay, we've seen things be able to happen for people, anywhere between 6 months and a year, but not if the boss is in their way. If the boss is in their way and the boss is not actually navigating it, either because they don't have the right relationship with that person, which is why that relationship can still be, pretty important. But for me, it's like, yeah, I like to look at it as who's that, the other person or next level boss that you'd want to work for, not just yours. Like, I feel like you've got to consider that way. And I also like that because it's insurance, because look, your boss, you don't know, that might change. I've seen some people unfortunately suffer in a role where it's like they were really close and then their boss moved or got fired or whatever it was. And now a new boss comes in. It's like they have to rebuild again with that boss. And that's why sometimes I like to have that little bit of insurance of like, how do you make sure that your eggs weren't in that single basket, whether that's internally or also, I like the third one, an external as well, or at least where you're keeping that alive. And this is why I love people who still on LinkedIn leverage LinkedIn, not just when they need the job, but in advance of it, because then they're on people's radars a little bit more. I'm curious on that, actually. LinkedIn, how important do you think LinkedIn is when it comes to that networking before people actually might, I don't even decide before they need it, because it's not necessarily about that new job, but when they are looking for the promotion or anything else, do you think mainly just focusing internally in the organization is what's critical, or do you think they should also be building those external relationships?
I think both are really important. I call it career insurance. So the first thing that I think that you should be doing is definitely focusing more so on your internal brand, because believe it or not, there's so many people still not on LinkedIn. And they probably never will be, because they're all in their little bubbles, but they just come out as soon as they get laid off. And they're like, and then their first post is, oh, here's LinkedIn, right? Should you be on LinkedIn? I think you should. But what I can give you is there's an example 2 weeks ago, a well-known person on LinkedIn, I won't say their function, 400,000 followers, got laid off from a large company this person's actively looking for a job, and people are like, why don't you have offers? And it's because that number still needs to be made up. You still need decision makers in that number. Can't be a whole bunch of people who say amen. So it is intentionally building the right network. For example, I'll tell you, my own coach only has 5,000 followers, but she makes $1 million a year. So it doesn't matter. I think it really just comes down to what's the makeup of your following. I do have a client that I'm working with right now. She's an executive at a Fortune 500. She does write content. We did get the buy-in from her leadership team about what her content pillars would be. So they didn't come on and see the good versus bad leaders post, and then she gets the side eye at work. So she is sharing things more in the personal development realm. It is getting her a lot of attention and speaking opportunities. We're building a portfolio career. And I think it goes back, Artin, to you, Michael, as well, about the TED Talks and all that. You can do all those things, and having a portfolio career actually will get you other opportunities because you're going to be in the room brushing elbows with other decision makers. So I think LinkedIn is important, but I do think your internal branding is even more important. And I think LinkedIn becomes equally important when you're ready, when you want to just maybe build that insurance, or if you're at a really large organization, like say an Amazon, and there could be somebody in another function who would never get to know you, and you're sharing your thought leadership. It's an opportunity for you. But again, I would say, I would temper that to say it's ensuring you have decision makers in your audience.
That makes sense. A lot of people who do aspire for that next role, there's this frustration some have because they don't want to be doing the next role until they're paid for the next role. But the reality is oftentimes is you need to prove yourself capable of that role, which is why I think that mentality of actually, almost moving yourself into that role sometimes, because then you could be like, hey, look here, and I want to get paid for this based on XYZ. But what's your philosophy on that?
I do think you have to start acting the next level. And acting the next level is holistically. That means turning your camera on. We're in a remote world. No one's going to want to see April Little in black and white on Zoom, and you're going to think you're going to get a promotion. You need to be visible. The next thing is to think about, okay, how am I visibly showing up? Am I wearing a Star Wars sweatshirt? So you do need to start dressing up to the next level too. I know that sounds old school, but there are a lot of things that we think we shouldn't be doing anymore that's still happening in corporate. And you still have to play that game. And then when we think about the work, it's measuring the work. Work is not all equal, especially when you want to grow. So that means, okay, there might be stuff functionally in your department that needs improvement, but start thinking about who's going to see it. Okay, only my boss and her boss are going to see it. I'm not volunteering for that. But I am going to think about maybe there's an enterprise, there could be an enterprise yellow belt or green belt project that there's a lot of people that need to be on. You start doing it by projects, not necessarily by work expansion.
Got it. Because that was going to be that question then, is how does somebody balance and manage that? Because, they've got their current job, but now it's that new job. But I think you just answered it with that, because it's almost like, it's not like all of a sudden the next day you're doing all that work. You just slowly start stepping into those projects. And usually, not always, but usually then also, this happened for me at least, then my manager acknowledges and realizes I'm playing there in that space. And sometimes my manager is going to be like, hey, look, I know you're willing to take on that other thing, but you're playing in these other projects now. Let's take that off your plate. That can happen naturally, especially with the right conversations. And then you get lower work removed, and it only helps towards the master plan.
Oh, yeah, 100%. But yeah, it's definitely all work is not equal. And even I made that mistake where I was like, oh, that didn't get me a promotion. But I'm like, well, only my boss saw it. So it's not going to do it.
Bro, exactly. And I think there was another important lesson I had from human resources at one point that I think people struggle with. And that was that sometimes people also think just doing more volume of the same thing deserves more pay. And the way that it's usually justified isn't quite that way. Sure, if you're a superstar and you can say that you're accomplishing 5 times what everybody else does, there is an argument there. But the reality is if it's still within what the actual job is, doing it faster than others isn't what gets you. What gets you there is when you teach others how to do it the faster way, so your department can now take on more work, which then means, you have the possibility of leading the team, or you can articulate how you introduce automation or innovation or other things like that. But being that IC alone who's just doing it better, faster, maybe you get a couple extra grand out of it, but it's not the longevity and what you could get after that.
Yeah, you'll usually get a free ticket to your home state,
Yeah,
and along with maybe you could pick out a mug or something off your company.
that's exactly it.
To slowly wrap this up, April, I want to pivot and just ask you some questions about LinkedIn. You have a fairly large following on LinkedIn, over 200,000, if I'm not mistaken. How did you build that audience of such a large following?
Wow. Okay, so now we're going into different conversations because someone told me I can't, and that person was my boss.
Love it.
So I have only been on LinkedIn for 2 years. Prior to that, I just had a profile because I was a recruiter and I was sourcing, never wrote content. So I've been on there since I left that job. I started trying to post, and she would say, "Well, this stuff is really helpful. You should only be sharing it with your team." It happened 3 or 4 times. I'm like, she doesn't want me to post. So I deleted the post, and I prior to that, for a whole year, I started learning how to post because I was still on there saving posts, learning how to post. And when I left, I came equipped with Histivity, motivation, and about 50 pieces of content. And so I think my like 5th post was about Peloton and the elitism around only helping people laid off from big name companies. And I said, that post actually, so I'm bringing that up because I got like 10,000 followers off of that just from that one post. LinkedIn is not like that anymore. That was 2022 LinkedIn. But I basically said, people come out of the woodworks giving confetti and ponies and plane rides and space shuttle rides for people from larger companies. But what about other people? Because I'm really big on the smaller company, working for different sizes and things of that nature. And so that's actually how I got my start. So I grew to about 100K in 8 months.
That's so fast. That's amazing. I mean, LinkedIn fast. Like people who don't know LinkedIn,
LinkedIn,
yeah.
yes, LinkedIn fast. And I do work with some of my clients now. I don't advertise it because, when you're speaking to everybody, you're speaking to no one. I do think I'm getting on a sales call for coaching, and they're like, "No, teach me how to grow LinkedIn." So I do have people that I am helping grow their LinkedIn now. And I actually just had one that got her first viral post yesterday. So I do that on the back end, but more so around your thought leadership to help you get ready to leave your job.
That's great. No, that's brilliant. Because again, some of that's the brand and what you build out there. Now with that though, and for you and your growth, aside from some of the virality to it, and obviously you had learned some advance, that still feels like a rapid, pace. Like some of the gurus out there right now are, just reaching over 200 now, but they maybe were at it for a while or started long ago and then stopped and then came back to it. So, I mean, is it that there's been enough that have gone viral for you, or is there anything else that you're doing that feels, different from others? I mean, you're engaging to a certain level there, but I don't know how much of your day goes into that. Like, what else are you doing?
I would say that I credit a lot of that to having a content library of a lot of things that have happened to me over my career, and I do storytell. That is my primary vehicle. I also love operational excellence and organization effectiveness. So that means that I do use a lot of corporate language. It means that when I'm talking in my post, I'm referencing one-on-ones. I'm referencing the very things that you would deal with day to day. So I'm definitely not a mindset coach. I'm very tactical. And I'm using terms like you work at the enterprise level. So I'm talking that person's language. And so that really helps me get buy-in and build trust with my audience. I also do storytell a lot of my discovery calls. So I always tell people when they get on discovery call, because sometimes now that I've reached 200K, people think that I'm a celebrity. I'm like, no, I just got bills to pay too. And they're like, oh my God, I'm talking to you. And it's like, well, I do use my discovery calls also as storytelling. You won't know the details. And I use my client stories as storytelling too, the ones that they approve. So whenever I use a client story, they have approved it. I've sent it to them in Slack and they've approved it, and the details have been changed up by 30%.
That's great. I think that's a great tip too, the storytelling side of it, because I think a lot of people steer a little bit clear of that, especially some of the people who might be in an organization or other things. And I know some of that can, comes with its own dynamics, but I love that you've also seemed to find ways with some of the people that you work with to find that right balance, because I think some people don't even start because they're like the organization, and some organizations don't care. And some organizations, it's just with the right parameters around it so that and then some organizations are like, do it, But also while you're at it, every now and then drop some really great posts about our company itself. Like, it's interesting how some turn their own team members into advocates for the culture and the.
That is a paid job. That is an absolute paid job. I do like so I will tell you, if I had to do it all over again and I ever went back to work, and I'm not ever above going back to work. If I ever went back to work, I told my husband the other day I would do it for a COO role at a startup. I would probably build my following if I had to start all over again through personal development, and I would stay away from work topics.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
That's the other safe range that I would build it from. And I know it works because there are times that once people start to know you for whatever you are, you really don't have to stick to that topic. And I know that to be true because I have had months where I might just write about personal development and I still get clients.
Yeah, they probably either don't notice enough because now it's just, oh, great. Yeah. And sometimes it might be refreshing. They're like, oh, cool. This is a new.
Yeah. Well, because you have to think about that you are the great separator from everybody else that's doing the same thing. And we all know career coaching saturated. So the difference between them picking you or another person, like the other day I posted my kids, was that she was like, you're a mom. That was the separator.
Yeah. Interesting.
Where there's tons of career coaches on here.
Well, this has been insightful and fascinating. I suppose LinkedIn is where someone can find you, but where else should people look for you?
So I'm primarily on LinkedIn. My .com is being worked on right now. So primarily you can find me on LinkedIn. I have started dabbling into IG and I do some reels, but don't think I will necessarily talk about careers over there. So you're welcome to follow me on IG as well. And it's I am April Little over there. And also I think there was a question I wanted to prepare for it if it's okay. I know we're over time. You mentioned my favorite books. What are your favorite books? So I have a list of 75 books. I do like Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. I do like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I do like Presence by, I want to make sure I'm saying her name right, Amy Cully. She also has one of the most watched TED Talks on YouTube. But I would also say that I don't read a lot. I think that you can still learn from escapism. So, for example, I love watching period pieces. You can find a lot of strategy in that. I recently watched a great show called Shogun. Those are from Disney, so you're familiar.
I loved it.
I watched it. He's like, I gotta watch it.
I loved it.
Fantastic. Game of Thrones is coming on next month. And there's a lot of strategy that you can actually use from shows that are not modern, where they have to communicate via raven or horseback versus a text message that you can actually adapt at work. When you think about the art of war and the art of silent war, and maybe people you don't like, maybe people you have to deal with. So I think you can also learn and prepare for your career as you practice escapism. And so while I do read those books, I do find myself reading fiction a bit more.
I love it. I have to say with, just as you mentioned, some of those examples, there's a movie for me, The Big Short. I don't know if you saw that one, but it was basically about the whole financial crash of 2008. And it had a great, cast in it, but the whole idea is that when I look at that, I'm like, this is the example when people don't understand why sometimes as an organization like that they could go off course, but it's because like if you watch that movie and you realize how many people were like knowing what they were doing wasn't right, but did it anyway because the culture accepted it or other things and things like that. There's just an interesting thing when I just watch that movie and I think about the few who did have some stronger values or those who decided to be like, I'm not following this whole pathway, and in some of those cases made millions because they went, yeah, they're right. But anyway, so yeah, I agree with you. Like you can watch some of these movies and there's these, so much you can learn from almost a human psychology perspective, as well as some strategy and other stuff. But I also a fan of each one of those books that you mentioned I've read. And yeah, those TED Talks, I think both Breen and Amy have some great TED Talks out there as well. So
I think Amy does, and also Masterclass. I did recently watch. And I watched it twice with Bob Iger from Disney. I thought that his masterclass was really good. So micro learning is great if you want to just like get a quick infusion of like, I'm feeling really stale. I want to do something different. And Melody Hobson, I really enjoyed her masterclass and I watched that twice. So, and those are all very inexpensive ways to coach yourself to success until you can find a coach.
Yeah. Great point. Love it.
Everybody please share and comment and let us know what you think. And I think if you found this episode interesting, we did a previous episode. I think, Michael, was it episode 3?
Yep.
I think episode 3. That's very relatable. So check that episode too, and we'll link to it at the bottom in the comment section. Thanks again, and see everybody on the next one.